Hello and welcome. On today's episode, we're actually going to be talking about foundations of hormone healing as well as foundations of inner healing and how they can overlap each other and why it's important to have an integrated approach to addressing both issues when you're pursuing healing an aspect of your body. And so I obviously, as a registered nurse, as a functional hormone coach, I work with women all over the world to balance their hormones. And primarily when I'm speaking to them over the phone, in text messenger, DMs, you name it, the principle or the most obvious challenge that they're facing, they don't always recognize that it's hormonal. And this is very common. And part of that is because it's manifesting as mood swings, irritability, fatigue, insomnia, anxiety, and there's still just a level of awareness that we're trying to bring into the holistic hormone community, where women begin to see those symptoms as not just emotional but physiological too. And why this matters is because if we don't address the problem appropriately from the beginning, we're going to end up feeling like we're chasing our tail. We're going to, try any number of supplements, herbs, tinctures, creams, medications, what have you, and really end up right back at square one, which nobody wants to do. So when we're doing that initial intake or that initial interview, a lot of times what I hear women say is, I feel like I'm losing my mind. I just feel like I'll never get better. Is this really the best that I'll ever feel? I'm not able to fulfill, my ministry calling or my life purpose because I'm so miserable all the time. I don't feel like I'm able to be the wife and mom that I know God has called me to be because I'm kind of trapped under these symptoms. And like I said, if we don't address the issue at the root from the very beginning, in a systematic way, what ends up happening is you end up feeling like you're chasing your tail, and nobody wants to have to go through that. I know for myself, when I was walking through my hormone craziness about 11 years ago, I ended up spending close to $15,000 just on doctor's appointments and supplements. That was not including, having to change my diet or lifestyle changes. And what took me 4 years to recover from, my clients are seeing in about 12 weeks because they have something that I did not have. And that is a systematic approach. So how do we identify what the issue really is? When we're talking about, especially women's hormones, where it is impacting our mental and emotional and our spiritual well-being, it really can be hard to really hone in on, okay, is this an emotional issue? Is this a spiritual issue? Or is this a physical issue? And a practitioner friend and I were actually just talking about this the other day, in which problem do you address first? Because when somebody comes to you and they have, 20 years of imbalance that needs to be dealt with, 20 years of really painful, uncomfortable symptoms, it can be very difficult to know where to start and what to tackle first. So in my practice, what we always tackle first is the physiology. And the reason why we tackle physiology first is not because it's more important than all of the other parts. It's not more important than your spiritual walk. It's not more important than your emotional well-being, but it provides that foundation through which everything else is built upon. So, for example, in my own life, in my own walk with the Lord, in my own healing journey, when my daughter was 10 months old, my hormones basically just crashed. They just pooped out on me. If you haven't heard my story, in the full capacity yet, I was having mood swings, insomnia, horrible debilitating anxiety, digestive issues, really heavy periods, really having cramping. And I felt very disconnected from God in that season because I was experiencing postpartum depression and anxiety, but also my body was a mess. And simultaneously, I was also experiencing PTSD from some trauma that had occurred much earlier in my life that kind of resurfaced after having a child. And so I'm sure that my doctor was looking at me like, where do we even start with you? Because this is such a hot mess. So when I say hot mess express, that is literally what I was. That is where I was. That was the experience of my life up to that point. And there was some really legitimate trauma and emotional stuff that I had to work through, emotional mindsets, belief systems about my health and my future that I needed to deal with. But because that physiology was not stable, there was very little work that I could do in the realm of addressing my spiritual healing or my emotional healing. And I remember I had met somebody online, a woman who was a mentor to me at the time, and I remember her praying for me very specifically and asking the Lord to heal my body and to essentially create this buffer around my life of safety until the spiritual element of my healing could take place. And so sometimes I think as believers, we get in this we want to rush the healing process. We think that maybe God's dissatisfied with us, or he's looking at us with, disappointment because we're struggling, or because we're having to walk through something, or because we're not, up to this whatever standard we think should be, instead of realizing that he loves us so much that he's actually going to take us by the hand and walk us through one step at a time through that healing journey. And so for me, I had to put the spiritual and even some of the emotional elements on the shelf until my physiology was stable enough that I could even address some of those other additional emotional components of my life. So when I'm working with somebody, I know that we are mind, body, spirit. So I have that perspective in every conversation that I have, whether it's working with women, whether it's working with children, doing organic acid testing or stool testing, functional medicine, approach to healing, you name it. I'm looking at it through a lens of we are mind, body, and spirit. So what do we need to address first to get this person moving in their healing process? And so in the context of women's hormones, the very first thing that we look at is, number one, we always do an assessment, meaning that we are looking at, from a clinical lens, where do all of your symptoms lie? And for women, those symptoms lie typically in three different categories. And we have, I personally, as a practitioner, having worked with over 200 women all over the world and looking at the clinical data. So this is all of the research and development. This is what you find on PubMed when you're Googling late at night and you're like, how do I get rid of my cramps? We're putting all of that together, and what we realize within that is that all women's hormone issues can really be boiled down to three main categories. And I know that some of you might tune out when I say that because it feels way more complicated than that, but I guarantee you that it's not. And what we found is that when we address each of those foundational root causes in a systematic way, meaning that we work with your body's physiology, then we see tremendous results at a far faster pace than if we just address them, based on the symptoms alone. So what do I mean by that? Every woman that comes to work with me, we first have them fill out a hormone imbalance checklist. So this checklist is built off of, over 10 years of clinical research, and it allows us to see very, very quickly where somebody's primary symptom or problem areas lie. So for example, if we have somebody that's like primarily struggling with insomnia, anxiety, fatigue, irritability, maybe some rage before their cycle, really low mood, and a history of, PMS and postpartum depression. What those symptoms tell us is that, based on the literature, but also clinical experience, is that there's a pretty significant issue in the gut-brain connection. And that can happen for a lot of different reasons. That can happen because of antibiotic usage. That can happen from chronic stress, which all of us have experienced to some capacity. For me, that was, primarily caused by chronic stress, but also, I was pretty much on antibiotics my whole life, for different ear infections and skin infections and all of those things. And so over time, those things do destroy not only the lining of our gut, but our natural balance of bacteria. And our hormones actually rely on the communication of specific bacteria and specific chemical messengers in order to work properly. And so if we just look at all of these symptoms and we say, wow, that person really needs to be on an SSRI or birth control, we're totally missing the mark as practitioners, because that's not really even what the data shows us. We have enough research and development now in the scientific community that actually can pinpoint exactly what strains of probiotics balance out specific bacteria or address certain problems. There are specific bacteria for ADHD or brain injuries, and so that's not really any different with our hormones. So we have that very first category, which is the gut-brain connection. And in the context of the Happy Hormones program, or if you're working with me as a client one-on-one, we're going to address that foundationally. Healing the gut-brain connection goes above and beyond just taking a good probiotic. It means that we also have to look at, how is your nervous system doing? How does your body respond to stress? How do you physiologically process stress? How do you emotionally process stress? Where is your thought process, those kind of mental roadblocks that we talk about that are contributing to stressors? And so in that gut healing phase, which is kind of right smack dab in the middle of our program, this is typically where we're going to start addressing the emotional and spiritual elements of your process. And that's for a couple of reasons. Typically because at this point, you've seen enough progress in your hormones that you now have the emotional and spiritual capacity to go there. That's the first thing. Two, is that we can't fully address healing our hormones unless we are also looking at healing our emotions and our emotional process. And for some of us, we just need to have like our reserves filled up.